Hello. The doc is in, and this is a little bit of a different kind of video. Usually I do just chapter by chapter reviews, but Tokyo Revengers is the first manga of my coverage that has come to a proper conclusion. And so as I previously mentioned earlier this month, when I first came back in my return video, that I wanted to do a review of the manga and kind of give my final thoughts on the series after it ended. Obviously, I'm a little bit late, but better late than never. This video is here, so feel free to listen, enjoy, and hear my thoughts on the series Tokyo Revengers. Just to give a short general synopsis, Tokyo Revengers is a delinquent manga / anime that grew in popularity largely around its anime adaptation's release in 2021. Despite its okay animation, the character writing and interpersonal drama among these young delinquents created an interesting manga that is filled with twists and turns and a very endearing cast. This story ended November 15th, 2022. I began my journey with Tokyo Revengers reading the manga prior to the anime getting a proper release. The twists throughout the story were gripping. The main villain, in the beginning, was engaging and his plans fast. I cared about every member of Tomen like these were my own friends. I cared about Takemichi's success and his struggle. I think up until post-Tenjuku content, the manga was pretty much perfect in my eyes, at least and the many eyes of most fans. The infamous ending of this arc is where most fans have their issues, and for good reason. Just a heads up, the majority of what I want to talk about is post Tenjuku, and I'll be going more into detail about content past that point. Prior to Tenjuku, I think that the story takes a fairly realistic tone and kind of sticks strictly with the characters and kind of like their home issues and to how that relates to their characterization, how they act as a part of the various gangs, and kind of centers around Takemichi helping these people through their issues and either avoiding like extreme events like people killing other people, as well as kind of like being like a sort of beacon of hope for people to like not go down a truly dark path, which I feel like is a lot of the reason why fans originally got into the series, which was just that the characters are really cool and we care about their story. And of course, mainly we got our protag, his main goal being to save Hina and be able to have a nice relationship with her in the future and save his new friends. Tenjuku feels like the climax of the story, and heading toward the end of the manga, everything just feels like it comes together nicely as Shinjuku concludes. Kisaki is dead and therefore can't mess up the future. Takemichi goes free back to the future and is even due to get married to Hina. All his friends are safe and living happy normal lives for the most part. But Takemichi chooses to go back to the past to save Mikey, who, while going down a bad path, chose to leave his friends as he felt like for their safety he had to be left to his own demons by himself. Besides Sanzu, this choice by the author is questionable for a number of reasons. First, Takemichi has achieved his goal and is happy. Second, we as readers have reached a satisfying conclusion. 3, remaining mysteries aren't crucial to being solved. These 3 things are what the continuation of the story past this point make every prior arc seem like flawless diamonds, and the rest of the stories seem, well, we'll get into that. But these 3 things combined, I mean, plenty of people have said, from my experience, and even people I've seen in my own personal life say, well, past Tenjuku, I just stopped reading the story because that was a satisfying conclusion I had. I felt no urge to read the rest of the story. And that's not because the rest of the story to them was bad necessarily, but they didn't even bother going that far because they were just like, well, I think the story is good now and I don't care for the reason why it continues. But I digress. The story continues, and I could and still swallow my concerns at this point, as it can be argued that the story has the potential for a more interesting ending going forward. A bittersweet ending perhaps where Takemichi loses everything for pushing too hard, or Takemichi ends up sacrificing himself for his friends, something along those lines. The story could keep going and be okay. To be fair, these are coping statements, and while I do stand by them, the reason why these statements need to be made at all is because the reader's integrity was lost here at this moment when we went back to the past once more to save Mikey. Three Deities. This arc represents the beginning of the general fall from grace amongst the community for the story. Three Deities begins at an interesting and almost entirely new cast. We are introduced to a number of new characters who, in a sense, are supposed to be the people we are supposed to care about going into the next saga of the story. Senju, a female gang member with a lot of promise, seems to have a lot of skills and big aspirations. South, unparalleled, huge, and dangerous. My personal favorite. Mikey, dark, brooding, impulsive. Yes, that poorly put in joke was intended. Moving on. This to me was an interesting setup that hopefully was going somewhere. It did not go anywhere. Let's skip over, middling section. We get introduced to the gangs. We hang out with Senju for a while. We're like, oh, she's pretty cool, whatever. Date turns into attack turns into Draken's death. Post Draken's death, the fandom was devastated but also angered. Why is Draken dead in exchange for some random girl we don't really know or care about? Why is Draken dead and no one seems to care that he was shot and killed, etc., etc. Questions like these mark another loss in reader integrity as we see a fan favorite character die to a no-name goon of an enemy gang. Some interesting discussion could be had about what has happened to Draken, but it's hard to ignore the almost pointlessness of his death, as almost everyone there kind of just glosses over the fact that Draken, a legend in universe, just got shot and killed by a random goon. I can't help but mention that it was by a random goon. It was so random. Nonetheless, subsequently, all three gangs show up and a war ensues. And for me, the war is interesting to my monkey brain and very exciting if you ignore some key details. First, Senju is washed and basically stands in no comparison to the other two deities. You could say a number of things about this, but I'm gonna just say it's a wasted character. Mikey kills South, basically giving him no time to breathe as a potential villain. While his death is engaging, I think that so much integrity is lost at this point on the part of the author that it's hard to ignore the flaws surrounding this very momentous moment and turn for Mikey's character. I mean, let's just think about it for like 1 second here. Mikey, while he has gotten close to killing people, Kazutora Bloody Halloween, and has been in instances where his dark impulses have flared and he's gone a little too he's gotten close to going a little too far. This is the first instance where he's like properly killed someone, and he killed someone on screen, like in front of everybody. All right, everybody's a witness to his bare-fisted murder, and then his terrible whooping of Takemichi, and it kind of feels like the community can't even get a chance to pay attention to it, because we gotta think about the fact that Draken died for this. Draken died so that then we could have like a cool moment, but nonetheless, like, he died, nonetheless. Post the Three Deities war, we get into the second war prep between Toman and Komen, or Kanto Manji Gang. And Takamichi's light descent is in full effect here as we hit Takamichi's lowest low in the story. He reconciles on the idea that he has permanently gotten drinking killed. We will get back to that later. And his own partner, Chifuyu, seems to blame him for Draken's death. He decides he'll go the rest of the journey alone. But through consoling of Hina, he realizes he should accept the help of his friends in full to resolve this issue. So then they get all the old members together and make a new team, Tokyo Manji Gang Generation 2, dubbed Tomen 2 by me. The decision to bring in a new gang and have a new generation of the Tokyo Manji Gang led by Takamichi was great and very enjoyable in the general community, and again for me personally. This mini arc showed off character writing that, when isolated from the arc it's directly tied to, comes off to me as something close to masterfully done. But all good things must come to an end. Once the team is completely together, it's time for Tokyo's revenge. Nonetheless, Takamichi and the Tomen 2 gang offer official war to Kanto Manji Gang. Then they meet and war is on. The war's beginning is pretty fire for the most part. Everyone gets their own moment to show off their fighting prowess. Takamichi's ass pull, quote unquote, extra strength is fine enough and hype surprise. For the most part, every important character gets to play a role in the outcome of this war, or has at least a character moment. Except for Senju, who basically gets used as a character to show how insane and heartless Sanzu is at this time, which is great for his character, but for Senju, basically she gets treated like a jobber, which I don't know how to feel about, because she was a part of the 3 deities, therefore meaning she should be like president of a gang level, which, I mean, you could argue maybe that doesn't count for anything, but still, nonetheless. My personal favorite headliner, the headliner fight, was Pa versus Mikey. It was a complete stomp, but it showed Pa's strength and showed his dedication and love for Mikey. It was a well executed emotional moment that on its own is great. We then head over to Sanzu's train plan and
Train all aboard the choo-choo train, all aboard the choo-choo train, all aboard,
Takamichi and Kakucho trying to stop him. The sequence was great, and it seems to build up suspense as Sanzu's true identity. To be clear, when I say Sanzu's identity, and not to say that we don't think Sanzu's Sanzu, but more so referring to the idea that at the time we were aware that there's a possibility of there being a second time leaper, and so we're wondering, based on his comment about you being able to see into the past or future or whatever, is he like a time leaper as well? Is he a trigger? Whatever. But nonetheless, we also have Kakucho's sacrifice during this time, and it gives a bit more gravity to the overall conflict. I also love this sequence where Taiju comes in on the bike and rams Sanzu into the train, and definitely adds a certain amount of suspension of disbelief for him joining Tomen, seeing as, you know, at the time of the Black Dragons, he was a bad guy, and by the end of it, it's not like he was convinced to be a good person, so that's a little bit odd, but once again, it's hype enough, and, you know, it's the ending of the manga, we can kind of let it slide. From there, after the two legends get squashed by Taiju, we finally get to the big climactic moments between president of the Tokyo Manji Gang Generation 2, Takamichi Hanagaki, better known as the Crybaby Hero, versus president of the Kanto Manji Gang. In my personal opinion, this fight is great for no other reason than his hype as shit in the idea of Takamichi, who at the very beginning of the story barely could even stand up to fight his bully, is now stepping toward a guy who has single-handedly dismantled some of the most notorious and powerful gang leaders right in front of him. Not only that, but there's an emotional aspect of Takamichi wanting to save his friend, and the pressure of those in Tomen and those who have died for Tomen urging him to save Mikey from his chosen fate. For the problems that the story had up to this point, this fight and its resolution at the time of release would decide the quality of the Tokyo Avengers really was going to have.
So that was a fucking lie.
All right. Let's talk about the last section. So, the fight's about to get underway, and Mikey goes dark impulse and proceeds to go berserker and beat the ever-loving crap out of every single person in the area, including people on his side. Example, Sanzu, Hanma. And we have some flashbacks to Mikey's past following this, but we'll touch on that in a second. Takemichi gets back up after everyone getting their ass beat and starts properly scrapping with Mikey and using his newfound future sight to be able to get a decisive hit off on Mikey, knocking him down. But nonetheless, let's get back on the story. Mikey gets back up after this and the fight continues, and then Mikey basically just beats Takemichi's future sight by just upping the ante too high for Takemichi to keep up with. And during their fight, as you know, they're going back and forth because, you know, of course they're talking, Mikey decides to reveal that his dark impulses were born after Shinichiro went back in time to save him. And also Shinichiro's a time leaper, which was part of the reveal. Anyway, now we can talk about the flashbacks regarding Mikey, Shinichiro, and the dark impulses. All in all, they're fucking stupid. Mikey's backstory on its own isn't bad, actually. Where basically he's prone to violence, he gets an unhealthy relationship with this sadness where he doesn't like crying and expresses his feelings when his parents died through fighting and violence. I actually think this makes sense and is well built up to, with his dark impulses, quote unquote, being a manifestation of his unresolved trauma from his youth. But you see, that's not what the story decides to fucking go with. Even though this makes perfect sense, we go in a different direction. Let's talk about that direction. In this story, the original timeline, Mikey dies after being a vegetable and living for a couple of years, but not really being able to say or do anything. Shinichiro takes the whole turn of events very hard and spirals for a while. Wakasa checks on Shin and basically tries to cheer him up at the club. While they're at the club, though, some randoms basically talk about some old guy who says that he can go to the past with some powers, and Shinichiro hyperfixates on the situation and basically gets the randos to tell him where the old guy is. He then goes to the old guy and he talks to him, and the old guy says he does have powers, but kind of says that he doesn't want to give them away, and kind of implies that Shinichiro should kill him for the powers, even though he kind of suggests there's another way. But nonetheless, Shinichiro's kind of hyperfixated / in a dark place, so he kills the guy.
How many times do we have to teach you this lesson, old man?
I love the young people.
And then he spirals some more because, you know, he murdered a guy, and so then proceeds to try to kill himself by jumping off a bridge. But just coincidentally, when he about to jump off the bridge, Sanzu is there and tries to stop him by jumping in right after him. And while Shinichiro is about to die, he touches Sanzu and boom, back to the past. And while in the past, Shinichiro then avoids the event that leads to Mikey's vegetabilization. But this is where the dark impulses, quote unquote, first appear, seeming to be more like a kind of curse that influences people to go murder crazy. And in this instance, specifically the instance where the plane and everything that everybody kind of clowned prior to us finding out all this stuff later on, causes Mikey to go berserk on Sanzu for breaking his stuff. Shin goes back to the future, Mikey's alive, and he talks to Sanzu about the fact that he time traveled, because Sanzu mentions the fact that like, oh, I have two different memories, I feel like two different events happened and yada yada yada. And so that's that. Also, Shinichiro gives Takemichi the powers at one point, and also it turns out that Kisaki was there as well. Also, I think Hina's also there. I can't really remember off the top of my head, but that's honestly not the point at all. But let me break it down to you in simpler terms for what it means for like the context of the overall story at this time. Basically, the whole story happens because Shinichiro killed some old guy with some time powers instead of being nice and letting him give him the powers, which then literally curses Shinichiro, so he will die to dark impulses and then passes the dark impulses, or like that curse, over to Mikey, meaning that the whole psychological aspect of this entire story is thrown out the window in favor of saying it wasn't me, it was the dark impulses.
Is this nigga serious?
Now, let's really get into the dirt, because things can get so much worse. We return to the present. The dark impulses take over Mikey again in real time, and Mikey and Takemichi fight again. In the end of this fight, it comes down to Mikey stabbing Takemichi through the chest with Sanzu's katana, and Takemichi like gives Mikey a hug, which brings him back from the dark impulse land or whatever. And Takemichi and Mikey in Takemichi's dying breath, and Mikey having a, I won't say nervous breakdown, but being all depressed about the fact that he killed his friend. We go back to the past. Yay. And we go so far back in the past that we go even before the original tournament's created, and we're back with Takemichi. Piercy's not dead. From there, the dumbest shit in the entire story happens, and I cannot stress that this is really fucking retarded. Basically, Mikey and Takemichi get together in the past and realize they have time leaped and decide to live out the rest of the past to fix everything. But before they do that, they get to the worst kind of slander I've ever heard in my entire life to my guy Chifuyu. And I quote, Takemichi says, "I've always fought this battle on my own, but now I have you," in reference to Mikey. What in the flying fuck is this line? Takemichi has had teammates and people who have worked with him along the process of fixing the future for a very, 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 very long time. But I digress. This line is great, actually, because it sums up the entire problem with the end of Tokyo Revengers. First, it feels as though the author pretty much towards the very last section of the story kind of just doesn't know what to do with his characters or how to conclude the story, because he just gets rid of the entire premise of the story and all the main plot points and all the weight and gravity of the story that existed in the first half, and even in some parts of Three Deities and some parts of the second war prep. But during this last section, when he's putting in all the flashbacks and really tying everything together, it feels like everything that was set up, anything that was previously important to the story, is now thrown out the window in favor of trying to get this happy ending at the very end. And the problem with it is that the happy ending doesn't even feel deserved at the end, because when you think about it, it basically comes down to there are no consequences for Takemichi's actions at all, and he basically pretends everything that happened in the previous timelines and everything just doesn't matter. Pretty much, I can't stress how much that line about oh, you're the only person. It's it basically makes it sound like, oh, this entire time it's been Takemichi. It's been a story about Takemichi and Mikey this whole time. But I'm this story, yeah, Mikey's been an important character, and like we all like Mikey, but Mikey was not the focal point of this story until the second half. Like, it's so weird that Mikey becomes the focal point of the story like this. Like, literally takes the place of, like, Deuterogonist, which I believe is second protagonist. I'm like, why? Why are we doing this? Not only that, but let's talk about Mikey, right? Like I said, Mikey's backstory, like his personal backstory, not the part in Chiro, but just his personal part of the backstory, is fine. I think that it fits in line with the rest of the story, where the main villains, or at least various characters in the story, have issues, like need to see a therapist issues, which is kind of the point. The point is that these are like normal kids, and they have a relatively reasonable descent into madness, right? Think Izana. Izana's a terrible, terrible person. But when you think about it and you see his backstory, it's like, yeah, he's probably a little bit of a fucked up person in general. But also, he has a lot of trauma and issues. That's why he does the things he does. He's very, very messed up. He needs a therapist. And that's what makes Izana engaging. That's what makes South kind of engaging if you don't really deal with his psychological aspect. Again, wasted character, but nonetheless. You think Kazutura, you think Taiju to a certain degree, not so much him. We don't really explore like his involvement with his psychological, but you kind of made the connections with it. Like, you know, that stuff is being built up. But when you take Mikey's story, right, and retroactively Katsutura's, but we're going to leave Katsutura alone, all right? Katsutura has nothing to do with this. When we take Mikey's story, it basically, you null and void his previous aspects. Because when you think about it, right, I'm a little bit ranting right now, but just bear with me here. When you think about Mikey's backstory, right, the idea is that he's already violent because of the kind of encouragement by his parents, somewhat unknowingly, somewhat knowingly, as well as him just having a bad relationship with his emotions and sadness, and like I explained before, right? But when you include, and that kind of goes into the idea that like, oh, that might be why he attacked Sanzu, like he's just kind of a little bit messed up in the head. But when they do Shinchiro's backstory, they then say, oh, the dark impulses take him over and that's why he gets violent. But then, did the part with his parents matter? Because if that's the case, then if it's just supernatural, right, then I could just say, well, then why do we even bother going into the part about him already being violent and fighting and stuff? Couldn't we just ignore that? And then he'd be like just a karate kid who fights discipline, and then the curse comes in, and then that really changes him and sends him down this path. I feel like again, the author starts off, I think he goes into like the second part with like a plan. Like he's like, oh, I want to kind of hit some more beats. I want to go into more stuff and kind of like go over the fact that Shinchiro's a time leaper, and I guess introduce other characters and kind of explore Sanzu more, etc., 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 right? We want to kind of hit certain beats. But in like the very last section, he just goes off the rails. Because I'm like, certain things just don't make sense anymore when including the very, very ending and like the conclusion about the fact that, you know, like Shinchiro and the whole dark impulse and stuff. Like the dark impulse and stuff like really is really bad. It's like it's dumb. Not only that, but speaking of the ending, let's talk about like what actually just happens. So the idea that they just skip, that we basically have like a huge time skip where basically everybody's just really friendly and kind of just is friends now. Like Kisaki, I believe Hama as well, joined the gang. Like, why? Like, I mean, I understand why. Like, I understand the idea that, like, oh, you know, if we make friends with them now, then they'll never become evil and try to manipulate us and whatever. But also, why? We just didn't need to do that. I mean, it's fine. Like, it makes sense, but just like the pay, I guess you could say there's no build up to that. So kind of just the way it's just kind of thrown in there, along with the fact that, like, oh, by the way, we're like gonna super time skip from here to the end of the story, by the way. It's like, huh? What do you mean Kisaki just joined the gang? Like, how's that work? But not only that, but I also don't appreciate the way that Hama was so heavily slighted in the story, because for the longest time, people had all these theories about, like, you know, after Kisaki died, like, it was like, oh, you know, why is Hama following Kisaki? And everybody was thinking, like, oh, Hama has to play an important part of the story. He's everywhere. It's like literally all throughout the story. He's always doing something. He seems kind of shady. He's always in the right places. He was working with Kisaki, and Kisaki was kind of aware that Takemichi could have been a time leaper, etc., etc. Maybe he knew it from somebody else. Maybe he was working with a time leaper. And it turns out the time leaper isn't Hama. Even though Hama seems to hold such an important part and is literally everywhere and seems like the kind of guy who would be like a time leaper, and it seemed like there was some important story going on with him, but nope, he was just a random guy, kind of like Madarame. But for some reason, like, I guess, well, actually, I say for some reason, but I guess Hama was just cool, so the author just decided to, like, include Hanma in the story, in places and stuff. I mean, Hanma, I like Hanma, but I don't know. I mean, yeah, overall, I'll say the story is fine. It's all right. But this last section retroactively makes the rest of the story suck, because I can't, when I said, right, coming up to the fight between Takemichi and Mikey, there were a lot of ways the story could have ended from that point going forward that still would have made the story good. Like I said, the drinking death people didn't like. That was just bad. The Senju situation was not well taken. The Dieties arc was all right, specifically because of the drinking. I think that the build up to the final war kind of reinvigorated people. People were kind of back into it. The fights were good. The character development in the fights was good. Again, Senju getting literally just dying effectively. Like, she might as well have just died as a casualty of war, because not only did we reset the story anyway, but also she just didn't do anything in the war at the end. But again, digressing. Post, like, everything involving that stuff, 3Ds were, if not for Draken's death and the weird situation when, like, the conclusion of the arc, I think everybody was kind of back on board. Like, interest being renewed and reinvigorated. And then the flashbacks are going, and the flashbacks seem okay. The situation with the plane, clearly there's something being held back. And then for the information that's being held back is that Shinjiro's the time leaper. Sounds like, I feel like, especially if you're someone who didn't bother reading past Shinjuku, the idea that Shinjiro was a time leaper sounds like a great idea, but the execution is just so disappointing. Like, it feels like so much of the right beats were hit, but you made so many mistakes coming up to them that it's like, I didn't even recognize you hit the right beat. It's like the same reason why, even though the situation between Mikey and South should be like crazy, like this is amazing. Like, this is like the moment. Like, Mikey's gone off the edge. He just killed somebody with his bare hands. Like, he's fighting crazy. He barely took any damage against this huge hulking monster. Like, this is supposed to be amazing. And so many people had already dropped the story because Draken died so unceremoniously to some goon. And then at the very end, the story that didn't even matter. You were upset about that part. It didn't even matter. Not only that, but there were no stakes. In the end, everything just works out, which isn't bad, but it feels so undeserved. Like, it doesn't feel like nothing was sacrificed for the story at all. Not a single thing. Everything was basically melodrama. Like, effectively, you can make the argument that had Takemichi shook Mikey's hand from the very, very beginning and just went all the way back, everything would have been fine. Like, if Mikey wanted to go all the way back and like change his entire past, boom, story would have been over. It would have been exactly equivalent to what just happened, because everything in the middle did not matter at all. At all. And I think the only reason that the story even plays out the way it does, in terms of the fact that everybody basically comes back to life and everybody's cool now, it's just so that then at the very end you can have like the whole situation where everybody's invited to the wedding, everybody's there, it's like a happy moment, all the characters we cared about and remember throughout and had this whole story with are now here. Honestly, if you just want to, I feel like the author, just because he wanted to draw that visual, he did all this. Well, I'm like, that's dumb. You ruined the integrity of the story for a picture. Like, I can't think of the rest of the story properly, because this section exists, is the context for which the rest of the story is leading up to the point where everybody resets and then everybody's cool now. The villains we fought did not matter because now they're good guys. It is so dumb. So dumb. And that is my feelings about Tokyo Revengers coming to an end. Great story, really, really retarded ending. So I'll give it like a 4 out of 10. Just below average. It ain't the worst thing ever. Like I said, that first section, that first half, spicy. The next couple of sections, not the worst thing ever. Last part, oh my god, you're gonna want to hurt yourself. But I think that's all for my thoughts about this manga. Thanks for watching all the way through. If you watched all the way through, feel free to check out my other videos or whatever. I'll be doing another review on another manga coming up pretty soon, because I just finished reading something. But for now, that is all. The doc is out. Peace.
Thank you for watching. Feel free to subscribe and watch the videos on the right. Other than that, the doc is out. Bye.